Book 6, Chapter 12 of The Mill on the Floss. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Serafina Saransky. The Mill on the Floss by George Eliot. Book 6, The Great Temptation, Chapter 12, A Family Party. Maggie left her good Aunt Gritty at the end of the week and went to Garum Firs to pay her visit to Aunt Pullet, according to agreement. In the meantime, very unexpected things had happened, and there was to be a family party at Garum to discuss and celebrate a change in the fortunes of the Tullivers, which was likely finally to carry away the shadow of their demerits like the last limb of an eclipse, and cause their hitherto obscured virtues to shine forth in full rounded splendour. It is pleasant to know that a new ministry, just come into office, are not the only fellow men who enjoy a period of high appreciation and full-blown eulogy. In many respectable families throughout this realm, relatives becoming creditable meet with a similar cordiality of recognition, which in its fine freedom from the coercion of any antecedents, suggests the hopeful possibility that we may some day, without any notice, find ourselves in full millennium, with cockatrices who have ceased to bite, and wolves that no longer show their teeth with any but the blandest intentions. Lucy came so early as to have the start even of Aunt Glegg, for she longed to have some undisturbed talk with Maggie about the wonderful news. It seemed, did it not, said Lucy, with her prettiest air of wisdom, as if everything, even other people's misfortunes, poor creatures, were conspiring now to make poor dear Aunt Tulliver and Cousin Tom, and naughty Maggie too, if she were not so obstinately bent on the contrary, as happy as they had deserved to be after all their troubles. To think that the very day after Tom had come back from Newcastle, that unfortunate young Jetsam, whom Mr. Wakem had placed at the mill, had been pitched off his horse in a drunken fit, and was lying at St. Oggs in a dangerous state, so that Wakem had signified his wish that the new purchasers should enter on the premises at once. It was very dreadful for that unhappy young man, but it did seem as if the misfortune had happened then, rather than at any other time, in order that Cousin Tom might all the sooner have the fit reward of his exemplary conduct. Papa thought so very highly of him. Aunt Tulliver must certainly go to the mill now, and keep house for Tom. That was rather a loss to Lucy, in the matter of household comfort, but then, to think of poor auntie being in her old place again, and gradually getting her comforts about her there. On this last point, Lucy had her cunning projects, and when she and Maggie had made their dangerous way down the bright stairs into the handsome parlour, where the very sunbeam seemed cleaner than elsewhere, she directed her manoeuvres, as any other great tactician would have done, against the weaker side of the enemy. "Aunt Pullet," she said, seating herself on the sofa and caressingly adjusting that lady's floating cap-string, "I want you to make up your mind what linen and things you will give Tom toward housekeeping, because you are always so generous. You give such nice things, you know, and if you set the example, Aunt Glegg will follow." "That she never can, my dear," said Mrs. Pullet, with unusual vigour, "for she hasn't got the linen to follow suit with mine, I can tell you. She'd never the taste, not if she'd spent the money. Big checks and live things. Like stags and foxes all her table linen is. Not a spot nor a diamond among 'em. But it is poor work, dividing one's linen before one dies. I never thought to have done that, Bessie," Mrs. Pullet continued, shaking her head and looking at her sister Tulliver, "when you and me chose the double diamond, the first flax ever we'd spun, and the Lord knows where yours is now." "Well, I'd no choice, I'm sure, sister," said poor Mrs. Tulliver, accustomed to consider herself in the light of an accused person. "I'm sure it was no wish of mine, as I should lie awake o' nights thinking of my best bleached linen all over the country." "Take a peppermint, Mrs. Tulliver," said Uncle Pullet, feeling that he was offering a cheap and wholesome form of comfort, which he was recommending by example. "Oh, but Aunt Pullet," said Lucy, "you've so much beautiful linen, and suppose you had daughters, then you must have divided it when they married." "Well, I don't say as I won't do it," said Mrs. Pullet, "for now Tom's so lucky, It's nothing but right his friend should look on him and help him. There's the tablecloths I bought at your sale, Bessie. It was nothing but good nature of me to buy 'em, for they've been lying in the chest ever since. But I'm not going to give Maggie any more of my Indy muslin and things, if she's to go into service again, when she might stay and keep me company, and do my sewing for me, if she wasn't wanted at her brother's. Going into service was the expression by which the Dodson mind represented to itself the position of teacher or governess, and Maggie's return to that menial condition, now circumstances offered her more eligible prospects, was likely to be a sore point with all her relatives, besides Lucy. Maggie, in her crude form, with her hair down her back, and altogether in a state of dubious promise, was at once ornamental and useful. The subject was revived in Aunt and Uncle Glegg's presence, over the tea and muffins. "Ha!" said Mr. Glegg, good-naturedly patting Maggie on the back. "Nonsense, nonsense! Don't let us hear of you taking a place again, Maggie. Why, you must have picked up half a dozen sweethearts at the bazaar. Isn't there one of them the right sort of article? Come now." "Mr. Glegg," said his wife, with that shade of increased politeness in her severity which she always put on with her crisper fronts, "you'll excuse me, but you're far too light for a man of your years. It's respect and duty to our aunts, and the rest of her kin as are so good to her, should have kept my niece from fixing about going away again, without consulting us. Not sweethearts, if I'm to use such a word, though it was never heard of in my family."
"Why, what did they call us, when we went to see 'em then, neighbour Pullet? They thought us sweet enough then,"
said Mr. Glegg, winking pleasantly, while Mr. Pullet, at the suggestion of sweetness, took a little more sugar. "Mr. Glegg," said Mrs. G., "if you're going to be undelicate, let me know."
"La, Jane, your husband's only joking," said Mrs. Pullet. "Let him joke while he's got health and strength. There's poor Mr. Tilt got his mouth drawn all o' one side, and couldn't laugh if he was to try."
"I'll trouble you for the muffineer, then, Mr. Glegg," said Mrs. G., "if I may be so bold to interrupt your joking. Though it's other people must see the joke in a niece's putting a slight on her mother's eldest sister, as if the head of the family, and only coming in and out on short visits all the time she's been in the town, and then settling to go away without my knowledge, as I'd lain caps out on purpose for her to make 'em up for me, and me as have divided my money so equal." "Sister," Mrs. Tulliver broke in anxiously, "I'm sure Maggie never thought of going away without staying at your house, as well as the others. Not as it's my wish that she should go away at all, but quite contrary. I'm sure I'm innocent, and I've said over and over again, 'My dear, you've no call to go away.' But there's 10 days or a fortnight Maggie'll have before she's fixed to go, and she can stay at your house just as well, and I'll step in when I can, and so will Lucy." "Bessie," said Mrs. Glegg, "if you'd exercise a little more thought, you might know I should hardly think it was worth while to unpin a bed and go to all that trouble now, just at the end of the time, when our house isn't above a quarter of an hour walk from Mr. Deane's. She can come the first thing in the morning, and go back the last at night, and be thankful she's got a good aunt so close to her to come and sit with. I know I should, when I was her age."
"La, Jane," said Mrs. Pullet, "it'd do your beds good to have somebody sleep in 'em. There's that stripped room smells dreadful of mould, and the glass mildewed like anything. I'm sure I thought I should be struck with death when you took me in."
"Oh, there's Tom!" exclaimed Lucy, clapping her hands. "He's come on Sinbad, as I told him. I was afraid he wasn't going to keep to his promise." Maggie jumped up to kiss Tom as he entered, with strong feeling, at this first meeting since the prospect of returning to the mill had been opened to him, and she kept his hand, leading him to the chair by her side. To have no cloud between herself and Tom was still a perpetual yearning in her, that had its root deeper than all change. He smiled at her very kindly this evening, and said, "Well, Magsie, how's Aunt Moss?"
"Come, come, sir," said Mr. Glegg, putting out his hand. "Why, you're such a big man. You carry all before you, it seems. You're coming to your luck a good deal earlier than us old folks did. But I wish you joy. I wish you joy. You'll get the mill all for your own again some day, I'll be bound. You won't stop halfway up the hill."
"But I hope he'll bear in mind as it is his mother's family as he owes it to," said Mrs. Glegg. "If he hadn't had them to take care after, he'd have been poorly off.
There was never any failures, nor lying, nor wastefulness in our family, nor dying without wills." "No, nor sudden deaths," said Aunt Pullet. "Allays the doctor called in. But Tom had the Dotson skin. I said that from the first. And I don't know what you mean to do, Sister Glegg, but I mean to give him a tablecloth of all my 3 biggest sizes but one, besides sheets. I don't say what more I shall do, but that I shall do. And if I should die tomorrow, Mr. Pullet, you'll bear it in mind, though you'll be blundering with the keys, and never remember as that on the 3rd shelf of the left-hand wardrobe, behind the nightcaps with the broad ties, not the narrow-frilled ones, is the key of the drawer in the blue room, where the key of the bluest closet is. You'll make a mistake, and I shall never be worthy to know it. You've a memory for my pills and draughts. Wonderful. I always say that of you. But you're lost among the keys." This gloomy prospect of the confusion that would ensue her decease was very afflicting on Mrs. Pullet. "Why, you carry it too far, Sophy, that locking in and out," said Mrs. Glegg, in a tone of some disgust at this folly. "You go beyond your own family. There's nobody can say I don't lock up, but I do what's reasonable, and no more. And as for the linen, I shall look out what's serviceable to make a present to my nephew. I've got cloth as has never been whitened, better worth having than other people's fine holland, and I hope he'll lie down in it and think of his aunt." Tom thanked Mrs. Glegg, but evaded any promise to meditate nightly on our virtues, and Mrs. Glegg effected a diversion for him by asking about Mr. Deane's intentions concerning steam. Lucy had had her far-sighted views in begging Tom to come on Sinbad. It appeared, when it was time to go home, that the man-servant was to ride the horse, and cousin Tom was to drive home his mother and Lucy. "You must sit by yourself, auntie," said the contriving young lady, "because I must sit by Tom. I have a great deal to say to him." In the eagerness of her affectionate anxiety for Maggie, Lucy could not persuade herself to defer a conversation about her with Tom, who, she thought, with such a cup of joy before him as this rapid fulfilment of his wish about the mill, must be compliant and flexible. Her nature supplied her with no keys to Tom's, and she was puzzled, as well as pained, to notice the unpleasant change on his countenance when she gave him the history of the way in which Philip had used his influence with his father. She had counted on this revelation as a great stroke of policy, which was to turn Tom's heart toward Philip at once, and, besides that, prove that the elder Wakem was ready to receive Maggie with all the honours of a daughter-in-law. Nothing was wanted, then, but for dear Tom, who always had that pleasant smile when he looked at cousin Lucy, to turn completely round, say the opposite of what he had always said before, and declare that, for his part, he was delighted that all the old grievances should be healed, and that Maggie should have Philip with all suitable dispatch. In cousin Lucy's opinion, nothing could be easier. But to minds strongly marked by the positive and negative qualities that create severity, strength of will, conscious rectitude of purpose, narrowness of imagination and intellect, great power of self-control, and a disposition to exert control over others, prejudices come as the natural food of tendencies which can get no sustenance out of that complex, fragmentary, doubt-provoking knowledge which we call truth. Let a prejudice be bequeathed, carried in the air, adopted by hearsay, caught in through the eye. However it may come, these minds will give it a habitation. It is something to assert strongly and bravely, something to fill up the void of spontaneous ideas, something to impose on others with the authority of conscious right. It is at once a staff and a baton. Every prejudice that will answer these purposes is self-evident. Our good, upright Tom Tulliver's mind was of this class. His inward criticism of his father's faults did not prevent him from adopting his father's prejudice. It was a prejudice against a man of lax principle and lax life, and it was a meeting point for all the disappointed feelings of family and personal pride. Other feelings added their force to produce Tom's bitter repugnance to Philip and to Maggie's union with him, and notwithstanding Lucy's power over her strong-willed cousin, she got nothing but a cold refusal ever to sanction such a marriage. But of course Maggie could do as she liked. She had declared her determination to be independent.
For Tom's part, he held himself bound by his duty to his father's memory, and by every manly feeling, never to consent to any relation with the Wakems. Thus, all that Lucy had effected by her zealous meditation was to fill Tom's mind with the expectation that Maggie's perverse resolve to go into a situation again would presently metamorph itself, as her resolves were apt to do, into something equally perverse, but entirely different, a marriage with Philip Wakem. End of Book 6, Chapter 12. Recording by Serafina Zaransky in Utrecht, Holland.
Book 6, Chapter 13 of The Mill on the Floss. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Mill on the Floss by George Eliot. Book 6, The Great Temptation. Chapter 13, Borne Along by the Tide. In less than a week, Maggie was at St. Oggs again, outwardly in much the same position as when her visit there had just begun. It was easy for her to fill her mornings apart from Lucy without any obvious effort, for she had her promised visits to pay to her aunt Glegg, and it was natural that she should give her mother more than usual of her companionship in these last weeks, especially as there were preparations to be thought of for Tom's housekeeping. But Lucy would hear of no pretext for her remaining away in the evenings. She must always come from Aunt Glegg's before dinner. "Else what shall I have of you?" said Lucy, with a tearful pout that could not be resisted. And Mr. Stephen Guest had unaccountably taken to dining at Mr. Deane's as often as possible, instead of avoiding that, as he used to do. At first he began his mornings with a resolution that he would not dine there, not even go in the evening, till Maggie was away. He had even devised a plan of starting off on a journey in this agreeable June weather. The headaches which he had constantly been alleging as grounds for stupidity and silence were a sufficient ostensible motive. But the journey was not taken, and by the fourth morning no distinct resolution was formed about the evenings. They were only foreseen as times when Maggie would still be present for a little while, when one more touch, one more glance might be snatched. For why not? There was nothing to conceal between them. They knew, they had confessed their love, and they had renounced each other. They were going to part. Honour and conscience were going to divide them. Maggie, with that appeal from her inmost soul, had decided it. But surely they might cast a lingering look at each other across the gulf, before they turned away never to look again till that strange light had for ever faded out of their eyes. Maggie, all this time, moved about with a quiescence and even torpor of manner, so contrasted with her usual fitful brightness and ardour, that Lucy would have had to seek some other cause for such a change, if she had not been convinced that the position in which Maggie stood between Philip and her brother, and the prospect of her self-imposed wearisome banishment, were quite enough to account for a large amount of depression. But under this torpor there was a fierce battle of emotions, such as Maggie in all her life of struggle had never known or foreboded. It seemed to her as if all the worst evil in her had lain in ambush till now, and had suddenly started up full-armed, with hideous, overpowering strength. There were moments in which a cruel selfishness seemed to be getting possession of her. Why should not Lucy, why should not Philip suffer? She had had to suffer through many years of her life, and who had renounced anything for her? And when something like that fullness of existence—love, wealth, ease, refinement, all that her nature craved, was brought within her reach, why was she to forego it, that another might have it? Another who perhaps needed it less. But amidst all this new passionate tumult, there were the old voices making themselves heard with rising power, till from time to time the tumult seemed quelled. Was that existence which tempted her the full existence she dreamed? Where then would be all the memories of early striving, all the deep pity for another's pain, which had been nurtured in her through years of affection and hardship, all the divine presentiment of something higher than mere personal enjoyment, which had made the sacredness of life? She might as well hope to enjoy walking by maiming her feet, as hope to enjoy an existence in which she set out by maiming the faith and sympathy that were the best organs of her soul. And then, if pain was so hard to her, what was it to others? Ah, God preserve me from inflicting, give me strength to bear it. How had she sunk into this struggle with temptation that she would once have thought herself as secure from as from deliberate crime? When was that first hateful moment in which she had been conscious of a feeling that clashed with her truth, affection, and gratitude, and had not shaken it from her with horror, as if it had been a loathsome thing? And yet, since this strange, sweet, subduing influence should not conquer her, since it was to remain simply in her own suffering, her mind was meeting Stephen's in that thought of his, that they might still snatch moments of mute confession before the parting came. For was he not suffering too? She saw it daily, saw it in the sickened look of fatigue with which, as soon as he was not compelled to exert himself, he relapsed into indifference towards everything but the possibility of watching her. Could she refuse sometimes to answer that beseeching look which she felt to be following her like a low murmur of love and pain? She refused it less and less, till at last the evening for both of them was sometimes made of a moment's mutual gaze. They thought of it till it came, and when it had come they thought of nothing else. One other thing Stephen seemed now and then to care for, and that was to sing. It was a way of speaking to Maggie. Perhaps he was not distinctly conscious that he was impelled to it by a secret longing, running counter to all his self-confessed resolves, to deepen the hold he had on her. Watch your own speech, and note how it is guided by your less conscious purposes, and you will understand that contradiction in Stephen. Philip Wakem was a less frequent visitor, but he came occasionally in the evening, and it happened that he was there when Lucy said, as they sat out on the lawn near sunset, "Now Maggie's tale of visits to Aunt Glegg is completed. I mean that we shall go out boating every day until she goes. She has not had half enough boating, because of these tiresome visits, and she likes it better than anything. Don't you, Maggie?" "Better than any sort of locomotion, I hope you mean," said Philip, smiling at Maggie, who was lolling backwards in a low garden chair. "Else she will be selling her soul to that ghostly boatman who haunts the Floss, only for the sake of being drifted in a boat for ever." "Should you like to be her boatman?" said Lucy. "Because if you would, you can come with us and take an oar. If the Floss were but a quiet lake instead of a river, we should be independent of any gentleman, for Maggie can row splendidly. As it is, we are reduced to ask the services of knights and squires who do not seem to offer them with great alacrity." She looked playful reproach at Stephen, who was sauntering up and down, and was just singing in pianissimo falsetto, "The thirst that from the soul doth rise, doth ask a drink divine." He took no notice, but still kept aloof. He had done so frequently during Philip's recent visits. "You don't seem inclined for boating," said Lucy, when he came to sit down by her on the bench. "Doesn't rowing suit you now?" "Oh, I hate a large party in a boat," he said, almost irritably. "I'll come when you have no one else." Lucy coloured, fearing that Philip would be hurt. It was quite a new thing for Stephen to speak in that way, but he had certainly not been well of late. Philip coloured too, but less from a feeling of personal offence than from a vague suspicion that Stephen's moodiness had some relation to Maggie, who started up from her chair as he spoke, and had walked towards the hedge of laurels to look down at the descending sunlight on the river. "As Miss Deane didn't know she was excluding others by inviting me," said Philip, "I am bound to resign." "No, indeed, you shall not," said Lucy, much vexed. "I particularly wish for your company tomorrow. The tide will suit at 10:30. It will be a delicious time for a couple of hours to row to Luckreth and walk back before the sun gets too hot. And how can you object to 4 people in a boat?" she added, looking at Stephen. "I don't object to people, but the number," said Stephen, who had recovered himself and was rather ashamed of his rudeness. "If I voted for a 4th at all, of course it would be you, Phil. But we won't divide the pleasure of escorting the ladies. We'll take it alternately. I'll go the next day." This incident had the effect of drawing Philip's attention with freshened solicitude towards Stephen and Maggie. But when they re-entered the house, music was proposed, and Mrs. Tulliver and Mr. Deane being occupied with cribbage, Maggie sat apart near the table, where the books and work were placed, doing nothing, however, but listening abstractedly to the music. Stephen presently turned to a duet, which he insisted that Lucy and Philip should sing. He had often done the same thing before, but this evening Philip thought he divined some double intention in every word and look of Stephen's, and watched him keenly, angry with himself all the while for this clinging suspicion. For had not Maggie virtually denied any ground for his doubts on her side? And she was truth itself. It was impossible not to believe her word and glance when they had last spoken together in the garden. Stephen might be strongly fascinated by her. What was more natural? But Philip felt himself rather base for intruding on what must be his friend's painful secret. Still he watched. Stephen, moving away from the piano, sauntered slowly towards the table near which Maggie sat, and turned over the newspapers, apparently in mere idleness. Then he seated himself with his back to the piano, dragging a newspaper under his elbow and thrusting his hand through his hair, as if he had been attracted by some bit of local news in the Lacombe Courier. He was in reality looking at Maggie, who had not taken the slightest notice of his approach. She always had additional strength of resistance when Philip was present, just as we can restrain our speech better in a spot we feel to be hallowed. But at last she heard the word dearest uttered in the softest tone of pained entreaty, like that of a patient who asks for something that ought to have been given without asking. She had never heard that word since the moments in the lane at Basset, when it had come from Stephen again and again, almost as involuntarily as if it had been an inarticulate cry. Philip could hear no word, but he had moved to the opposite side of the piano, and could see Maggie start and blush, raise her eyes an instant towards Stephen's face, but immediately look apprehensively towards himself. It was not evident to her that Philip had observed her, but a pang of shame under the sense of this concealment made her move from her chair and walk to her mother's side to watch the game at cribbage. Philip went home soon after in a state of hideous doubt mixed with wretched certainty. It was impossible for him now to resist the conviction that there was some mutual consciousness between Stephen and Maggie, and for half the night his irritable, susceptible nerves were pressed upon almost to frenzy by that one wretched fact. He could attempt no explanation that would reconcile it with her words and actions. When at last the need for belief in Maggie rose to its habitual predominance, he was not long in imagining the truth. She was struggling, she was banishing herself. This was the clue to all he had seen since his return. But athwart that belief there came other possibilities that would not be driven out of sight. His imagination wrought out the whole story. Stephen was madly in love with her. He must have told her so. She had rejected him and was hurrying away. But would he give her up, knowing, Philip felt the fact with heart-crushing despair, that she was made half helpless by her feeling toward him? When the morning came, Philip was too ill to think of keeping his engagement to go in the boat. In his present agitation he could decide on nothing. He could only alternate between contradictory intentions. First he thought he must have an interview with Maggie and entreat her to confide in him. Then again he distrusted his own interference. Had he not been thrusting himself on Maggie all along? She had uttered words long ago in her young ignorance. It was enough to make her hate him that these should be continually present with her as a bond. And had he any right to ask for a revelation of feelings which she had evidently intended to withhold from him? He would not trust himself to see her till he had assured himself that he could act from pure anxiety for her and not from egoistic irritation. He wrote a brief note to Stephen and sent it early by the servant, saying that he was not well enough to fulfil his engagement to Miss Deane. Would Stephen take his excuse and fill his place? Lucy had arranged a charming plan which made her quite content with Stephen's refusal to go in the boat. She discovered that her father was to drive to Lindum this morning at 10. Lindum was the very place she wanted to go to make purchases, important purchases, which must by no means be put off for another opportunity, and Aunt Tulliver must go too, because she was concerned in some of the purchases. "You will have your row in the boat just the same, you know," she said to Maggie when they went out of the breakfast-room and upstairs together. "Philip will be here at 10:30, and it is a delicious morning. Now don't say a word against it, you dear dolorous thing. What's the use of me being a fairy godmother if you set your face against all the wonders I work for you? Don't think of awful cousin Tom. You may disobey him a little." Maggie did not persist in objecting. She was almost glad of the plan, for perhaps it would bring her some strength and calmness to be alone with Philip again. It was like revisiting the scene of a quieter life, in which the very struggles were repose, compared with the daily tumult of the present. She prepared herself for the boat, and at 10:30 sat waiting in the drawing-room. The ring of the door-bell was punctual, and she was thinking, with half-sad, affectionate pleasure, of the surprise Philip would have in finding that he wished to be with her alone, when she distinguished a firm, rapid step across the hall that was certainly not Philip's. The door opened, and Stephen Guest entered. In the first moment they were both too much agitated to speak, for Stephen had learnt from the servant that the others were gone out. Maggie had started up and sat down again, with her heart beating violently, and Stephen, throwing down his cap and gloves, came and sat by her in silence. She thought Philip would be coming soon, and with great effort, for she trembled visibly, she rose to go to a distant chair. "He is not coming," said Stephen in a low tone. "I am going in the boat." "Oh, we can't go," said Maggie, sinking into her chair again. "Lucy did not expect she would be hurt. Why has not Philip come?" "He is not well. He asked me to come instead." "Lucy's gone to Lindum," said Maggie, taking off her bonnet with hurried, trembling fingers. "We must not go." "Very well," said Stephen, dreamily, looking at her, as he rested his arm on the back of his chair. "Then we'll stay here." He was looking into her deep, deep eyes, far off and mysterious as the starlit blackness, and yet very near and timidly loving. Maggie sat perfectly still, perhaps for moments, perhaps for minutes, until the helpless trembling had ceased and there was a warm glow on her cheek. "The man is waiting. He has taken the cushion," she said. "Will you go and tell him?" "What shall I tell him?" said Stephen, almost in a whisper. He was looking at the lips now. Maggie made no answer. "Let us go," Stephen muttered entreatingly, rising and taking her hand to raise her too. "We shall not be long together." And they went. Maggie felt she was being led down the garden among the roses, being helped with firm, tender care into the boat, having the cushion and cloak arranged for her feet, and her parasol opened for her, which she had forgotten, all by this stronger presence that seemed to bear her along without any act of her own will, like the added self which comes with the sudden exalting influence of a strong tonic, and she felt nothing else. Memory was excluded. They glided rapidly along, Stephen rowing, helped by the backward flowing tide, past the Tofton trees and houses, on between the silent sunny fields and pastures, which seemed filled with a natural joy that had no reproach for theirs, the breath of the young unwearied day, the delicious rhythmic dip of the oars, the fragmentary song of a passing bird heard now and then, as if it were only the overflowing of brimful gladness, the sweet solitude of a twofold consciousness that was mingled into one by that grave, untiring gaze which need not be averted. What else could there be in their minds for the first hour? Some low, subdued, languid exclamation of love came from Stephen from time to time, as he went on rowing idly, half automatically. Otherwise they spoke no word, for what could words have been but an inlet to thought? And thought did not belong in that enchanted haze in which they were enveloped. It belonged to the past, and the future that lay outside the haze. Maggie was only dimly conscious of the banks as they passed them, and dwelt with no recognition on the villages. She knew there were several to be passed before they reached Luckreth, where they always stopped and left the boat. At all times she was so liable to fits of absence that she was likely enough to let her waymarks pass unnoticed. But at last Stephen, who had been rowing more and more idly, ceased to row, laid down the oars, folded his arms, and looked down on the water, as if watching the pace at which the boat glided without his help. This sudden change roused Maggie. She looked at the far-stretching fields, at the banks close by, and felt they were entirely strange to her. A terrible alarm took possession of her. "Oh, have we passed Lackford, where we were to stop?" she exclaimed, looking back to see if the place were out of sight. No village was to be seen. She turned round again with a look of distressed questioning at Stephen. He went on watching the water, and said in a strange, dreamy, absent tone, "Yes, a long way." "Oh, what shall I do?" cried Maggie in an agony. "We shall not get home for hours. And Lucy, oh, God help me!" She clasped her hands and broke into a sob, like a frightened child. She thought of nothing but of meeting Lucy and seeing her look of pained surprise and doubt, perhaps of just upbraiding. Stephen moved and sat near her, and gently drew down the clasped hands. "Maggie," he said, in a deep tone of slow decision, "let us never go home again, till no one can part us, till we are married. Let us never go home again." The unusual tone, the startling words, arrested Maggie's sob, and she sat quite still, wondering, as if Stephen might have seen some possibilities that would alter everything, and annul the wretched fact. "See, Maggie, how everything has come without our seeking, in spite of all our efforts. We never thought of being alone together again. It has all been done by others. See how the tide is carrying us out, away from all those unnatural bonds that we have been trying to make faster around us, and trying in vain. It will carry us on to Torby, and we can land there, and get some carriage, and hurry to York, and then to Scotland, and never pause a moment till we are bound to each other, so that only death can part us. It is the only right thing, dearest. It is the only way of escaping from this wretched entanglement. Everything has concurred to point it out to us. We have contrived nothing, we have thought of nothing ourselves." Stephen spoke with deep, earnest pleading. Maggie listened, passing from her startled wonderment to the yearning after that belief that the tide was doing it all, that she might glide along with the swift, silent stream, and not struggle any more. But across that stealing influence came the terrible shadow of past thoughts, and the sudden horror lest now, at last, the moment of fatal intoxication was close upon her, calling up feelings of angry resistance towards Stephen. "Let me go," she said in an agitated tone, flashing an indignant look at him, and trying to get her hands free. "You have wanted to deprive me of any choice. You knew we were come too far. You have dared to take advantage of my thoughtlessness. It is unmanly to bring me to such a position." Stung by this reproach, he released her hands, moved back to his former place, and folded his arms, in a sort of desperation at the difficulty Maggie's words had made present to him. If she would not consent to go on, he must curse himself for the embarrassment he had led her into. But the reproach was the unendurable thing. The one thing worse than parting with her was, that she should feel he had acted unworthily towards her. At last he said, in a tone of suppressed rage, "I didn't notice that we had passed Luckworth until we had got to the next village, and then it came to my mind that we would go on. I can't justify it. I ought to have told you. It is enough to make you hate me, since you don't love me well enough to make everything else indifferent to you, as I do you. Shall I stop the boat and try to get you out here? I'll tell Lucy I was mad, and that you hate me, and you shall be clear of me for ever. No one can blame you, because I have behaved unpardonably to you." Maggie was paralysed. It was easier to resist Stephen's pleading than this picture he had called up of himself suffering while she was vindicated, easier even to turn away from his look of tenderness than from this look of angry misery, that seemed to place her in selfish isolation from him. He had called up a state of feeling in which the reasons which had acted on her conscience seemed to be transmitted into mere self-regard. The indignant fire in her eyes was quenched, and she began to look at him with timid distress. She had reproached him for being hurried into irrevocable trespass, she who had been so weak herself. "As if I shouldn't feel what happened to you just the same," she said, with reproach of another kind, the reproach of love asking for more trust. This yielding to the idea of Stephen's suffering was more fatal than the other yielding, because it was less distinguishable from that sense of others' claims which was the moral basis of her resistance. He felt all the relenting in her look and tone. It was heaven opening again. He moved to her side and took her hand, leaning his elbow on the back of the boat, and saying nothing. He dreaded to utter another word. He dreaded to make another movement that might provoke another reproach or denial from her. Life hung on her consent. Everything else was hopeless, confused, sickening misery. They glided along in this way, both resting in that silence as in a haven, both dreading lest their feelings should be divided again, till they became aware that the clouds had gathered, and that the slightest perceptible freshening of the breeze was growing and growing, so that the whole character of the day was altered. "You will be chill, Maggie, in this thin dress. Let me raise the cloak over your shoulders. Get up an instant, dearest." Maggie obeyed. There was an unspeakable charm in being told what to do, and having everything decided for her. She sat down again, covered with the cloak, and Stephen took to his oars again, making haste, for they must try to get to Torby as fast as they could. Maggie was hardly conscious of having said or done anything decisive. All yielding is attended with a less vivid consciousness than resistance. It is the partial sleep of thought. It is the submergence of her own personality by another. Every influence tended to lull her into acquiescence. That dreamy gliding in the boat which had lasted for 4 hours and had brought some weariness and exhaustion, the recoil of her fatigued sensations from the impracticable difficulty of getting out of the boat at this unknown distance from home and walking for long miles, all helped to bring her into more complete subjection to that strong, mysterious charm which made a last parting from Stephen seem the death of all joy, and made the thought of wounding him like the first touch of the torturing iron before which resolution shrank. And then there was the present happiness of being with him, which was enough to absorb all her languid energy. Presently Stephen observed a vessel coming after them. Several vessels, among them the steamer to Mudport, had passed them with the early tide, but for the last hour they had seen none. He looked more and more eagerly at this vessel, as if a new thought had come into his mind along with it, and then he looked at Maggie hesitatingly. "Maggie, dearest," he said at last, "if this vessel should be going to Mudport, or to any convenient place on the coast northward, it would be our best plan to get them to take us on board. You are fatigued, and it may soon rain. It may be a wretched business getting to Torby in this boat. It's only a trading vessel, but I dare say you can be made tolerably comfortable. We'll take the cushions out of the boat. It is really our best plan. They'll be glad enough to take us. I've plenty of money about me. I can pay them well." Maggie's heart began to beat with reawakened alarm at this new proposition, but she was silent. One course seemed as difficult as another. Stephen hailed the vessel. It was a Dutch vessel going to Mudport, the English mate informed him, and if this wind held, would be there in less than 2 days. "We have got out too far with our boat," said Stephen. "I was trying to make for Torby, but I'm afraid of the weather, and this lady, my wife, will be exhausted with fatigue and hunger. Take us on board, will you, and haul up the boat. I'll pay you well." Maggie, now really faint and trembling with fear, was taken on board, making an interesting object of contemplation to admiring Dutchmen. The mate feared the lady would have a poor time of it on board, for they had no accommodation for such entirely unlooked-for passengers, no private cabin larger than an old-fashioned church pew. But at least they had Dutch cleanliness, which makes all other inconveniences tolerable, and the boat cushions were spread into a couch for Maggie on the poop with all alacrity. But to pace up and down the deck leaning on Stephen, being upheld by his strength, was the first change that she needed. Then came food, and then quiet reclining on the cushions, with the sense that no new resolution could be taken that day. Everything must wait till tomorrow. Stephen sat beside her, with her hand in his. They could only speak to each other in low tones, only look at each other now and then, for it would take a long while to dull the curiosity of the 5 men on board, and reduce these handsome young strangers to that minor degree of interest which belongs, in a sailor's regard, to all objects nearer than the horizon. But Stephen was triumphantly happy. Every other thought or care was thrown into unmarked perspective by the certainty that Maggie must be his. The leap had been taken now. He had been tortured by scruples. He had fought fiercely with overmastering inclination. He had hesitated, but repentance was impossible. He murmured forth in fragmentary sentences his happiness, his adoration, his tenderness, his belief that their life together must be heaven, that her presence with him would give rapture to every common day, that to satisfy her lightest wish was dearer to him than all other bliss, that everything was easy for her sake, except to part with her, and now they never would part. He would belong to her for ever, and all that was his was hers, had no value for him except as it was hers. Such things, uttered in low, broken tones, by the one voice that has first stirred the fibre of young passion, have only a feeble effect on experienced minds at a distance from them. To poor Maggie they were very near. They were like nectar held close to thirsty lips. There must be then, a life for mortals here below which was not hard and chill, in which affection would no longer be self-sacrifice. Stephen's passionate words made the vision of such life more fully present to her than it had ever been before. And the vision, for the time, excluded all realities, all except the returning sun-gleams which broke out on the water as the evening approached, and mingled with the visionary sunlight of promised happiness, all except the hand that pressed hers, and the voice that spoke to her, and the eyes that looked at her with grave, unspeakable love. There was to be no rain after all. The clouds rolled off to the horizon again, making the great purple rampart and long purple isles of that wondrous land which reveals itself to us when the sun goes down, the land that the evening star watches over. Maggie was to sleep all night on the poop. It was better than going below, and she was covered with the warmest wrappings the ship could furnish. It was still early, when the fatigues of the day brought on a drowsy longing for perfect rest, and she laid down her head, looking at the faint dying flush in the west, where the one golden lamp was getting brighter and brighter. Then she looked up at Stephen, who was still seated by her, hanging over her as he leaned his arm against the vessel's side. Behind all the delicious visions of these last hours, which had flowed over her like a soft stream and made her entirely passive, there was the dim consciousness that the condition was a transient one, and that the morrow must bring back the old life of struggle. There were thoughts which would presently avenge themselves for this oblivion. But now nothing was distinct to her. She was being lulled to sleep with that soft stream still flowing over her, with those delicious visions melting and fading like the wondrous aerial land of the west. End of Book 6, Chapter 13 of The Mill on the Floss.
Book 6, Chapter 14 of The Mill on the Floss. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by L.C. The Mill on the Floss by George Eliot. Book 6, The Great Temptation. Chapter 14, Waking. When Maggie was gone to sleep, Stephen, weary too with his unaccustomed amount of rowing, and with the intense inward life of the last 12 hours, but too restless to sleep, walked and lounged about the deck with his cigar far on into midnight, not seeing the dark water, hardly conscious there were stars, living only in the near and distant future. At last fatigue conquered restlessness, and he rolled himself up in a piece of tarpaulin on the deck near Maggie's feet. She had fallen asleep before 9, and had been sleeping for 6 hours before the faintest hint of a midsummer daybreak was discernible. She awoke from that vivid dreaming which makes the margin of our deeper rest. She was in a boat on the wide water with Stephen. and in the gathering darkness something like a star appeared, that grew and grew till they saw it was the Virgin seated in St. Oggs' boat, and it came nearer and nearer, till they saw the Virgin was Lucy, and the boatman was Philip, no, not Philip, but her brother, who rowed past without looking at her, and she rose to stretch out her arms and call to him, and their own boat turned over with the movement, and they began to sink, till with one spasm of dread she seemed to awake, and find she was a child again in the parlour at evening twilight, and Tom was not really angry. From the soothed sense of that false waking, she passed to the real waking, to the plash of water against the vessel, and the sound of a footstep on the deck, and the awful starlit sky. There was a moment of utter bewilderment before her mind could get disentangled from the confused web of dreams, but soon the whole terrible truth urged itself upon her. Stephen was not by her now. She was alone with her own memory and her own dread. The irrevocable wrong that must blot her life had been committed. She had brought sorrow into the lives of others, into the lives that were knit up with hers by trust and love. The feeling of a few short weeks had hurried her into the sins her nature had most recoiled from, breach of faith and cruel selfishness. She had rent the ties that had given meaning to duty, and had made herself an outlawed soul, with no guide but the wayward choice of her own passion. And where would that lead her? Where had it led her now? She had said she would rather die than fall into that temptation. She felt it now that the consequences of such a fall had come before the outward act was completed. There was at least this fruit from all her years of striving after the highest and best, that her soul, though betrayed, beguiled, ensnared, could never deliberately consent to a choice of the lower. And a choice of what? O God, not a choice of joy, but of conscious cruelty and hardness. For could she ever cease to see before her Lucy and Philip, with their murdered trust and hopes? Her life with Stephen could have no sacredness. She must forever sink and wander vaguely, driven by uncertain impulse, for she had let go the clue of life, that clue which once in the far-off years her young need had clutched so strongly. She had renounced all delights then, before she knew them, before they had come within her reach. Philip had been right when he told her that she knew nothing of renunciation. She had thought it was quiet ecstasy. She saw it face to face now, that sad, patient, loving strength which holds the clue of life, and saw that the thorns were forever pressing on its brow. The yesterday, which could never be revoked, if she could have changed it now for any length of inward silent endurance, she would have bowed beneath that cross with a sense of rest. Daybreak came, and the reddening eastern light, while her past life was grasping her in this way, with that tightening clutch which comes in the last moments of possible rescue. She could see Stephen now lying on the deck, still fast asleep, and with the sight of him there came a wave of anguish that found its way in a long-suppressed sob. The worst bitterness of parting, the thought that urged the sharpest inward cry for help, was the pain it must give to him. But surmounting everything was the horror at her own possible failure, the dread lest her conscience should be benumbed again, and not rise to energy till it was too late. Too late. It was too late already not to have caused misery. Too late for everything, perhaps, but to rush away from the last act of baseness, the tasting of joys that were wrung from crushed hearts. The sun was rising now, and Maggie started up with the sense that a day of resistance was beginning for her. Her eyelashes were still wet with tears, as, with her shawl over her head, she sat looking at the slowly rounding sun. Something roused Stephen, too, and getting up from his hard bed, he came to sit beside her. The sharp instinct of anxious love saw something to give him alarm in the very first glance. He had a hovering dread of some resistance in Maggie's nature that he would be unable to overcome. He had the uneasy consciousness that he had robbed her of perfect freedom yesterday. There was too much native honour in him for him not to feel that, if her will should recoil, his conduct would have been odious, and she would have a right to reproach him. But Maggie did not feel that right. She was too conscious of a fatal weakness in herself, too full of the tenderness that comes with the foreseen need for inflicting a wound. She let him take her hand when he came to sit down beside her, and smiled at him, only with rather a sad glance. She could say nothing to pain him till the moment of possible parting was nearer. And so they drank their cup of coffee together, and walked about the deck, and heard the captain's assurance that they should be in at Mudport by 5 o'clock, each with an inward burthen, but in him it was an undefined fear which he trusted to the coming hours to dissipate. In her it was a definite resolve on which she was trying silently to tighten her hold. Stephen was continually, through the morning, expressing his anxiety at the fatigue and discomfort she was suffering, and alluded to landing and to the change of motion and repose she would have in a carriage, wanting to assure himself more completely by presupposing that everything would be as he had arranged it. For a long while Maggie contented herself with assuring him that she had had a good night's rest, and that she didn't mind about being on the vessel. It was not like being on the open sea. It was only a little less pleasant than being in a boat on the Floss. But a suppressed resolve will betray itself in the eyes, and Stephen became more and more uneasy as the day advanced, under the sense that Maggie had entirely lost her passiveness. He longed, but did not dare, to speak of their marriage, of where they would go after it, and the steps he would take to inform his father and the rest of what had happened. He longed to assure himself of a tacit assent from her, but each time he looked at her he gathered a stronger dread of the new, quiet sadness with which she met his eyes, and they were more and more silent. "Here we are in sight of Mudport," he said at last. "Now, dearest," he added, turning toward her with a look that was half beseeching, "the worst part of your fatigue is over. On the land we can command swiftness. In another hour and a half we shall be in a chaise together, and that will seem rest to you after this." Maggie felt it was time to speak. It would only be unkind now to assent by silence. She spoke in the lowest tone, as he had done, but with distinct decision. "We shall not be together. We shall have parted." The blood rushed to Stephen's face. "We shall not," he said. "I'll die first." It was as he had dreaded. There was a struggle coming. But neither of them dared to say another word till the boat was let down, and they were taken to the landing-place. Here there was a cluster of gazers and passengers awaiting the departure of the steamboat to St. Oggs. Maggie had a dim sense, when she landed, and Stephen was hurrying her along on his arm, that someone had advanced toward her from that cluster as if he were coming to speak to her. But she was hurried along, and was indifferent to everything but the coming trial. A porter guided them to the nearest inn and posting-house, and Stephen gave the order for the chaise as they passed through the yard. Maggie took no notice of this, and only said, "Ask them to show us into a room where we can sit down." When they entered, Maggie did not sit down, and Stephen, whose face had a desperate determination in it, was about to ring the bell when she said in a firm voice, "I'm not going. We must part here." "Maggie," he said, turning round toward her and speaking in the tones of a man who feels a process of torture beginning, "do you mean to kill me? What is the use of it now? The whole thing is done." "No, it is not done," said Maggie. "Too much is done, more than we can ever remove the trace of. But I will go no farther. Don't try to prevail with me again. I couldn't choose yesterday." What was he to do? He dared not go near her. Her anger might leap out and make a new barrier. He walked backward and forward in maddening perplexity. "Maggie," he said at last, pausing before her and speaking in a tone of imploring wretchedness, "have some pity. Forgive me for what I did yesterday. I will obey you now. I will do nothing without your full consent. But don't blight our lives forever by a rash perversity that can answer no good purpose to anyone, that can only create new evils. Sit down, dearest. Wait. Think what you are going to do. Don't treat me as if you couldn't trust me." He had chosen the most effective appeal, but Maggie's will was fixed unswervingly on the coming wrench. She had made up her mind to suffer. "We must not wait," she said in a low but distinct voice. "We must part at once." "We can't part, Maggie," said Stephen more impetuously. "I can't bear it. What is the use of inflicting that misery on me? The blow, whatever it may have been, has been struck now. Will it help anyone else that you should drive me mad?" "I will not begin any future even for you," said Maggie tremulously, with a deliberate consent to what ought not to have been. "What I told you at Basset I feel now. I would rather have died than fall into this temptation. It would have been better if we had parted forever then, but we must part now." "We will not part!" Stephen burst out, instinctively placing his back against the door, forgetting everything he had said a few moments before. "I will not endure it. You'll make me desperate. I shan't know what I do." Maggie trembled. She felt that the parting could not be effected suddenly. She must rely on a slower appeal to Stephen's better self, She must be prepared for a harder task than that of rushing away while resolution was fresh. She sat down. Stephen, watching her with that look of desperation which had come over him like a lurid light, approached slowly from the door, seated himself close beside her, and grasped her hand. Her heart beat like the heart of a frightened bird, but this direct opposition helped her. She felt her determination growing stronger. "Remember what you felt weeks ago," she began with beseeching earnestness. "Remember what we both felt, that we owed ourselves to others and must conquer every inclination which could make us false to that debt. We have failed to keep our resolutions, but the wrong remains the same." "No, it does not remain the same," said Stephen. "We have proved that it was impossible to keep our resolutions. We have proved that the feeling which draws us toward each other is too strong to be overcome. That natural law surmounts every other. We can't help what it clashes with." "It is not so, Stephen. I'm quite sure that is wrong. I have tried to think it again and again. But I see, if we judged in that way, there would be a warrant for all treachery and cruelty. We could justify breaking the most sacred ties that can ever be formed on earth. If the past is not to bind us, where can duty lie? We should have no law but the inclination of the moment." "But there are ties that can't be kept by mere resolution," said Stephen, starting up and walking about again. "What is outward faithfulness? Would they have thanked us for anything so hollow as constancy without love?" Maggie did not answer immediately. She was undergoing an inward as well as an outward contest. At last she said, with a passionate assertion of her conviction, as much against herself as against him, "That seems right at first, but when I look further I'm sure it is not right. Faithfulness and constancy mean something else besides doing what is easiest and pleasantest to ourselves. They mean renouncing whatever is opposed to the reliance others have in us, whatever would cause misery to those whom the course of our lives has made dependent on us. If I had been better, nobler, those claims would have been so strongly present with me. I should have felt them pressing on my heart so continually, just as they do now in the moments when my conscience is awake, that the opposite feeling would never have grown in me, as it has done. It would have been quenched at once. I should have prayed for help so earnestly, I should have rushed away as we rush from hideous danger. I feel no excuse for myself, none. I should never have failed toward Lucy and Philip as I have done, if I had not been weak, selfish, and hard, able to think of their pain without a pain to myself that would have destroyed all temptation. Oh, what is Lucy feeling now? She believed in me, she loved me, she was so good to me. Think of her." Maggie's voice was getting choked as she uttered these last words. "I can't think of her," said Stephen, stamping as if with pain. "I can think of nothing but you, Maggie. You demand of a man what is impossible. I felt that once, but I can't go back to it now, and where is the use of your thinking of it except to torture me? You can't save them from pain now, you can only tear yourself from me and make my life worthless to me. And even if we could go back and both fulfill our engagements, if that were possible now, it would be hateful, horrible to think of your ever being Philip's wife, of your ever being the wife of a man you didn't love. We have both been rescued from a mistake." A deep flush came over Maggie's face, and she couldn't speak. Stephen saw this. He sat down again, taking her hand in his, and looking at her with passionate entreaty. "Maggie, dearest, if you love me, you are mine. Who can have so great a claim on you as I have? My life is bound up in your love. There is nothing in the past that can annul our right to each other. It is the first time we have either of us loved with our whole heart and soul." Maggie was still silent for a little while, looking down. Stephen was in a flutter of new hope. He was going to triumph, but she raised her eyes and met his with a glance that was filled with the anguish of regret, not with yielding. "No, not with my whole heart and soul, Stephen," she said with timid resolution. "I have never consented to it with my whole mind. There are memories and affections and longings after perfect goodness that have such a strong hold on me, they would never quit me for long. They would come back and be pain to me, repentance. I couldn't live in peace if I put the shadow of a wilful sin between myself and God. I have caused sorrow already, I know, I feel it, but I have never deliberately consented to it. I have never said, 'They shall suffer that I may have joy.' It has never been my will to marry you. If you were to win consent from the momentary triumph of my feeling for you, you would not have my whole soul. If I could wake back again into the time before yesterday, I would choose to be true to my calmer affections and live without the joy of love." Stephen loosed her hand, and rising impatiently, walked up and down the room in suppressed rage. "Good God!" he burst out at last. "What a miserable thing a woman's love is to a man's! I could commit crimes for you, and you can balance and choose in that way. But you don't love me. If you had a tithe of the feeling for me that I have for you, it would be impossible to you to think for a moment of sacrificing me. But it weighs nothing with you that you are robbing me of my life's happiness." Maggie pressed her fingers together almost convulsively as she held them clasped on her lap. A great terror was upon her, as if she were ever and anon seeing where she stood by great flashes of lightning, and then again stretched forth her hands in the darkness. "No, I don't sacrifice you. I couldn't sacrifice you," she said as soon as she could speak again. "But I can't believe in a good for you that I feel, that we both feel, is a wrong toward others. We can't choose happiness either for ourselves or for another. We can't tell where that will lie. We can only choose whether we will indulge ourselves in the present moment, or whether we will renounce that for the sake of obeying the divine voice within us, for the sake of being true to all the motives that sanctify our lives. I know this belief is hard. It has slipped away from me again and again. But I have felt that if I let it go forever, I should have no light through the darkness of this life." "But Maggie," said Stephen, seating himself by her again, "is it possible you don't see that what happened yesterday has altered the whole position of things? What infatuation is it, what obstinate prepossession that blinds you to that? It is too late to say what we might have done, or what we ought to have done. Admitting the very worst view of what has been done, it is a fact we must act on now. Our position is altered. The right course is no longer what it was before. We must accept our own actions and start afresh from them. Suppose we had been married yesterday? It is nearly the same thing. The effect on others would not have been different. It would only have made this difference to ourselves," Stephen added bitterly, "that you might have acknowledged then that your tie to me was stronger than to others." Again a deep flush came over Maggie's face, and she was silent. Stephen thought again that he was beginning to prevail. He had never yet believed that he should not prevail. There are possibilities which our minds shrink from too completely for us to fear them. "Dearest," he said in his deepest, tenderest tone, leaning toward her and putting his arm round her, "you are mine now. The world believes it. Duty must spring out of that now. In a few hours you will be legally mine, and those who had claims on us will submit. They will see that there was a force which declared against their claims." Maggie's eyes opened wide in one terrified look at the face that was close to hers, and she started up, pale again. "Oh, I can't do it," she said, in a voice almost of agony. "Stephen, don't ask me, don't urge me. I can't argue any longer. I don't know what is wise, but my heart will not let me do it. I feel their trouble now. It is as if it were branded on my mind. I have suffered and had no one to pity me, and now I have made others suffer. It would never leave me. It would embitter your love to me. I do care for Philip, in a different way. I remember all we said to each other. I know how he thought of me as the one promise of his life. He was given to me that I might make his lot less hard, and I have forsaken him. And Lucy, she has been deceived, she who trusted me more than anyone. I cannot marry you. I cannot take a good for myself that has been wrung out of their misery. It is not the force that ought to rule us, this that we feel for each other. It would rend me away from all that my past life has made dear and holy to me. I can't set out on a fresh life and forget that. I must go back to it and cling to it, else I shall feel as if there were nothing firm beneath my feet." "Good God, Maggie!" said Stephen, rising too and grasping her arm. "You rave. How can you go back without marrying me? You don't know what will be said, dearest. You see nothing as it really is." "Yes, I do. But they will believe me. I will confess everything. Lucy will believe me. She will forgive you, and some good will come by clinging to the right. Dear Stephen, let me go. Don't drag me into deeper remorse. My whole soul has never consented. It does not consent now." Stephen let go her arm and sank back on his chair, half stunned by despairing rage. He was silent a few moments, not looking at her, while her eyes were turned toward him yearningly, in alarm at this sudden change. At last he said, still without looking at her, "Go, then. Leave me." Don't torture me any longer. I can't bear it." Involuntarily she leaned toward him and put out her hand to touch his, but he shrank from it, as if it had been burning iron, and said again, "Leave me." Maggie was not conscious of a decision as she turned away from that gloomy, averted face, and walked out of the room. It was like an automatic action that fulfills a forgotten intention. What came after? A sense of stairs descended as if in a dream, of flagstones, of a chaise and horses standing, then a street, and a turning into another street where a stage-coach was standing, taking in passengers, and the darting thought that that coach would take her away, perhaps toward home. But she could ask nothing yet. She only got into the coach. Home, where her mother and brother were, Philip, Lucy, the scene of her very cares and trials, was the haven toward which her mind tended, the sanctuary where sacred relics lay, where she would be rescued from more falling. The thought of Stephen was like a horrible throbbing pain, which yet, as such pains do, seemed to urge all other thoughts into activity. But among her thoughts, what others would say and think of her conduct was hardly present. Love and deep pity and remorseful anguish left no room for that. The coach was taking her to York, farther away from home, but she did not learn that until she was set down in the old city at midnight. It was no matter, she could sleep there and start home the next day. She had her purse in her pocket with all her money in it, a banknote and a sovereign. She had kept it in her pocket from forgetfulness, after going out to make purchases the day before yesterday. Did she lie down in the gloomy bedroom of the old inn that night, with her will bent unwaveringly on the path of penitent sacrifice? The great struggles of life are not so easy as that. The great problems of life are not so clear. In the darkness of that night she saw Stephen's face turned toward her in passionate, reproachful misery. She lived through again all the tremulous delights of his presence with her, that made existence an easy floating in a stream of joy, instead of a quiet, resolved endurance and effort. The love she had renounced came back upon her with a cruel charm. She felt herself opening her arms to receive it once more, and then it seemed to slip away and fade and vanish, leaving only the dying sound of a deep, thrilling voice that said, "Gone, forever gone." End of Book 6, Chapter 14.
One of the Mill on the Floss. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. That's LibriVox.org. Recording by Paradise Camouflage. The Mill on the Floss by George Eliot. Book 7, The Final Rescue. Chapter 1, The Return to the Mill. Between 4 and 5 on the afternoon of the 5th day from that on which Stephen and Maggie had left St. Oggs, Tom Tulliver was standing on the gravel walk outside the old house at Dorricote Mill. He was master there now. He had half fulfilled his father's dying wish, and by years of steady self-government and energetic work he had brought himself near to the attainment of more than the old respectability which had been the proud inheritance of the Dodsons and Tullivers. But Tom's face as he stood in the hot, still sunshine of that summer afternoon had no gladness, no triumph in it. His mouth wore its bitterest expression, his severe brow its hardest and deepest fold. As he drew down his hat farther over his eyes to shelter them from the sun, and thrusting his hands deep into his pockets, began to walk up and down the gravel. No news of his sister had been heard since Bob Jacken had come back in the steamer from Moodport, and put an end to all improbable suppositions of an accident on the water, by stating that he had seen her land from a vessel with Mr. Stephen Guest. Would the next news be that she was married, or what? Probably that she was not married. Tom's mind was set to the expectation of the worst that could happen, not death, but disgrace. As he was walking with his back towards the entrance gate, and his face towards the rushing mill stream, a tall, dark-eyed figure that we know well approached the gate, and paused to look at him with a fast-beating heart. Her brother was the human being of whom she had been most afraid from her childhood upward, afraid with that fear which springs in us when we love one who is inexorable, unbending, unmodifiable, with a mind that we can never mould ourselves upon, and yet that we cannot endure to alienate from us. That deep-rooted fear was shaking Maggie now, but her mind was unswervingly bent on returning to her brother as the natural refuge that had been given her. In her deep humiliation over the retrospect of her own weakness, in her anguish at the injury that she had inflicted, she almost desired to endure the severity of Tom's reproof, to submit in patient silence to that harsh, disapproving judgment against which she had so often rebelled. It seemed no more than just to her now. Who was weaker than she was? She craved that outward help to her better purpose, which would come from complete submissive confession, from being in the presence of those whose looks and words would be a reflection on her own conscience. Maggie had been kept on her bed at York for a day with that prostrating headache which was likely to follow on the terrible strain of the previous day and night. There was an expression of physical pain still about her brow and eyes, and her whole appearance, with her dress so long unchanged, was worn and distressed. She lifted the latch of the gate and walked in slowly. Tom did not hear the gate. He was just then close upon the roaring dam, but he presently turned, and, lifting up his eyes, saw the figure whose worn look and loneliness seemed to him a confirmation of his worst conjectures. He paused, trembling and white with disgust and indignation. Maggie paused too, 3 yards before him. She felt the hatred in his face, felt it rushing through her fibres. But she must speak. "Tom," she began faintly, "I am come back to you. I come back home for refuge to tell you everything." "You'll find no home with me," he answered, with tremulous rage. "You have disgraced us all. You've disgraced my father's name. You have been a curse to your best friends. You have been base, deceitful. No motives are strong enough to restrain you. I wash my hands of you forever. You don't belong to me." Their mother had come to the door now. She stood paralyzed by the double shock of seeing Maggie and hearing Tom's words. "Tom," said Maggie with more courage, "I am perhaps not so guilty as you believe me to be. I never meant to give way to my feelings. I struggled against them. I was carried too far in the boat to come back on Tuesday. I came back as soon as I could." "I don't believe in you any more," said Tom, gradually passing to the tremulous excitement of the first moment to cold inflexibility. "You have been carrying on a clandestine relation with Stephen Guest, as you did before with another. He went to see you at my Aunt Moses. You walked alone with him in the lanes. You must have behaved as no modest girl would have done to her cousin's lover. Else that could never have happened. The people at Luckreth saw you pass. You passed all the other places. You knew what you were doing. You have been using Philip Wakem as a screen to deceive Lucy, the kindest friend you ever had. Go and see the return you've made her. She's ill, unable to speak. My mother can't go near her, lest you remind her of you." Maggie was half stunned, too heavily pressed upon by her anguish even to discern any difference between her actual guilt and her brother's accusations, still less to vindicate herself. "Tom," she said, crushing her hands together under her cloak in the effort to speak again, "whatever I have done, I repent it bitterly. I want to make amends. I will endure anything. I want to be kept from doing wrong again." "What will keep you?" said Tom, with cruel bitterness. "Not religion, not your natural feelings of gratitude and honour. And he would deserve to be shot if it were not." But you are 10 times worse than he is. I loathe your character and your conduct. You struggled with your feelings, you say? Yes, I have had feelings to struggle with, but I conquered them. I've had a harder life than you have had, but I've found my comfort in doing my duty. But I will sanction no such character as yours. The world shall know that I feel the difference between right and wrong. If you're in want, I'll provide for you. Let my mother know. But you shall not come under this roof. It is enough that I have to bear the thought of your disgrace. The sight of you is hateful to me. Slowly Maggie was turning away with despair in her heart, but the poor frightened mother's love leapt out now, stronger than all dread. My child, I'll go with you. You've got a mother. Oh, the sweet rest of that embrace to the heart-stricken Maggie! More helpful than all wisdom is one draught of simple human pity that will not forsake us. Tom turned and walked into the house. "Come on, my child," Mrs. Tulliver whispered. "He'll let you stay and sleep in my bed. He won't deny that if I ask him." "No, mother," said Maggie in a low tone, like a moan. "I will never go in." "Then wait for me outside. I'll get ready and come with you." When his mother appeared with her bonnet on, Tom came out to her in the passage and put money into her hands. "My house is yours, mother, always," he said. "You will come and let me know everything you want. You will come back to me." Poor Mrs. Tulliver took the money, too afraid to say anything. The only thing clear to her was the mother's instinct that she would go with her unhappy child. Maggie was waiting outside the gate. She took her mother's hand, and they walked a little way in silence. "Mother," said Maggie at last, "we will go to Luke's cottage. Luke will take me in. He was very good to me when I was a little girl. He's got no room for us, my dear, now. His wife's got so many children. I don't know where to go, if it isn't to one of your aunts, and I hardly durst," said poor Mrs. Tulliver, quite destitute of mental resources in the extremity. Maggie was silent a little while, and then said, "Let us go to Bob Jenkins, mother. His wife will have room for us, if they have no other lodger." So they went on their way to St. Oggs, to the old house by the riverside. Bob himself was at home, with a heaviness in heart which resisted even the new joy and pride of possessing a 2-month-old baby, quite the liveliest of its age that had ever been born to prince or packman. He would perhaps not so thoroughly have understood all the dubiousness of Maggie's appearance with Mr. Stephen Guest on the quay at Mudport if he had not witnessed the effect it produced on Tom when he went to report it, and since then the circumstances, which in any case gave a disastrous character to elopement, had passed beyond the more polite circles of St. Oggs, and had become a matter of common talk, accessible to the grooms and errand boys. So that when he opened the door and saw Maggie standing before him in her sorrow and weariness, he had no questions to ask except one which he dared only ask himself: where was Mr. Stephen Guest? Bob, for his part, hoped he might be in the warmest apartment of an asylum understood to exist in the other world for gentlemen who were likely to be in fallen circumstances there. The lodgings were vacant, and both Mrs. Jakin the larger and Mrs. Jakin the less were commanded to make all things comfortable for the old Mrs. and the young Miss. Alas that she was still Miss! The ingenious Bob was sorely perplexed as to how this result could have come about, how Mr. Stephen Guest could have gone away from her, or could have let her go away from him, when he had the chance of keeping her with him. But he was silent, and would not allow his wife to ask him a question, would not present himself in the room, lest it should appear like intrusion in a whist prey, having the same chivalry towards dark-eyed Maggie as in the days when he had bought her the memorable present of books. But after a day or two, Mrs. Tulliver was gone to the mill again for a few hours, to see to Tom's household matters. Maggie had wished this. After the first violent outburst of feeling, which came as soon as she had no longer any active purpose to fulfil, she was less in need of her mother's presence. She even desired to be alone with her grief. But she had been solitary only a little while, in the old sitting-room that looked on the river, when there came a tap at the door, and turning round her sad face as she said, "Come in," she saw Bob enter, with the baby in his arms and Mumps at his heels. "We'll go back if it disturbs you, miss," said Bob. "No," said Maggie in a low voice, wishing that she could smile. Bob, closing the door behind him, came and stood before her. "You see, we've got a little one, miss, and I wanted you to look at it, and take it into your arms, if you'd be so good. For we made free to name it after you, and it'd be better for your taking a bit of notice on it." Maggie could not speak, but she put out her arms to receive the tiny baby, while Mumps snuffed at it anxiously, to ascertain that this transference was all right. Maggie's heart had swelled at this action and speech of Bob's. She knew well enough that it was a way he had chosen to show his sympathy and respect. "Sit down, Bob," she said presently, as he sat down in silence, finding his tongue unmanageable in quite a new fashion, refusing to say what he wanted it to say. "Bob," she said after a few moments, looking down at the baby and holding it anxiously, as if she feared it might slip from her mind in her fingers, "I have a favour to ask of you." "Don't you speak so, miss," said Bob, grabbing the skin of Mumps's neck. "If there's anything I can do for you, I should look upon it as a day's earnings." "I want you to go to Dr. Kent's and ask to speak to him, and tell him that I am here, and should be very grateful if he would come to me while my mother is away. She will not come back till evening." Miss, I'd do it in a minute. It is but a step. But Dr. Kent's wife lies dead. She's to be buried tomorrow. Died the day I come back from Mudport. It's all the more pity she should have died just now if you want him. I hardly like to go anigh him yet." "Oh, no, Bob," said Maggie. "We must let it be. Till after a few days, perhaps, when you hear that he is going about again. But perhaps he may be going out of town, to a distance," she added, with a new sense of despondency at this idea. "Not he, miss," said Bob. "He'll not go away. He isn't one of them gentle folks as to go and cry at watering places when their wives die. He's got summat else to do. He looks fine and sharp after the parish, he does. He christened the little un, and he was at me to know what I did of a Sunday, as I didn't come to church. But I told him I was upon the travel 3 parts of the Sundays, and then I'm so used to being on my legs, I can't sit so long on end. And law, sir, said I, a packman can do with a small allowance of church. It tastes strong, says I. There's no call to lay it on thick. Miss, how good the little un is with you. It's like as if it knowed you. It partly does, I'll be bound, like the birds know the morning. Bob's tongue was now evidently loosed from its unwonted bondage, and might even be in danger of doing more work than was required of it. But the subjects on which he longed to be informed were so steep and difficult of approach that his tongue was likely to run on along the level rather than to carry him on that unbeaten road. He felt this, and was silent again for a little while, ruminating much on the possible forms in which he might put a question. At last he said, in a more timid voice than usual, "Will you give me leave to ask you only one thing, miss?" Maggie was rather startled, but she answered, "Yes, Bob, if it is about myself, not about anyone else." "Well, miss, it's this. Do you owe anyone a grudge?" "No, not anyone," said Maggie, looking upon him inquiringly. "Why?" "Oh, laws, miss," said Bob, pinching Mumps's neck harder than ever. "I wish you didn't tell me. I'd leather him till I couldn't see. I would, and a justice might do what he liked to me arter." "Oh, Bob," said Maggie, faintly smiling, "you're a very good friend to me, but I shouldn't like to punish anyone, even if they've done me wrong. I've done wrong myself too often." This view of things was puzzling to Bob, and he threw more obscurity than ever over what could possibly have happened between Stephen and Maggie. But further questions would have been too intrusive, even if he could have framed them suitably, and he was obliged to carry baby away again to an expectant mother. "Happen you'd like Mumps for company, miss?" he said, when he had taken the baby again. "He's rare company, Mumps is. He knows everything, and makes no bother about it. If I tell him, he'll lie before you and watch you as still, just as he watches my pack. You'd better let me leave him a bit. He'll get fond on you. Laws, it's a fine thing to have a dumb brute fond of you. It'll stick to you and make no jaw." "Yes, do leave him, please. I think I should like to have Mumps for a friend." "Mumps, lie down here," said Bob, pointing to a place in front of Maggie, "and never do you stir till you're spoken to." Mumps lay down at once, and made no sign of restlessness when his master left the room. End of Book 7, Chapter 1. Recording by Andrew from Inverarnham, Scotland. Book 7, Chapter 2 of The Mill on the Floss. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox, LibriVox.org. Recording by Paradise Camouflage. The Mill on the Floss by George Eliot. Book 7, The Final Rescue. Chapter 2, St. Oggs passes judgment. It was soon known throughout St. Oggs that Miss Tulliver was come back. She had not then eloped in order to be married to Mr. Stephen Guest. At all events, Mr. Stephen Guest had not married her, which came to the same thing, so far as her culpability was concerned. We judge others according to results. How else? Not knowing the process by which results are arrived at. If Miss Tulliver, after a few months of well-chosen travel, had returned as Mrs. Stephen Guest, with a post-marital trousseau, and all the advantages possessed even by the most unwelcome wife of an only son, public opinion, which at St. Oggs as elsewhere always knew what to think, would have judged in strict consistency with those results. Public opinion in these cases is always of the feminine gender, not the world, but the world's wife. And she would have seen that two handsome young people, the gentlemen of quite the first family of St. Oggs, having found themselves in a false position, have been led into a course which, to say the least of it, was highly injudicious, and productive of sad pain and disappointment, especially to that sweet young thing, Miss Deane. Mr. Stephen Guest had certainly not behaved well, but then young men were liable to those sudden, infatuated attachments, and bad as it may seem in Mrs. Stephen Guest to admit the faintest advances from her cousin's lover, indeed it had been said that she was actually engaged to young Wakem. Old Wakem himself had mentioned it. Still, she was very young, and a deformed young man, you know, and young Guest so against her will. What could she do? She couldn't come back then. No one would have spoken to her. And how very well that maize-coloured satinette becomes her complexion. It seems as if the folds in front were quite come in. Several of her dresses are made so. They say he thinks nothing too handsome to buy for her. Poor Miss Deane! She is very pitiable. But then there was no positive engagement, and the air at the coast will do her good. After all, if young Guest felt no more for her than that, it was better for her not to marry him. What a wonderful marriage for a girl like Miss Tulliver! Quite romantic. Why, young Guest will put up for the borough at the next election. Nothing like commerce nowadays. That young Wakem nearly went out of his mind. He always was rather queer, but now he's gone abroad again to be out of the way. Quite the best thing for a deformed young man. Miss Unit declares she will never visit Mr. and Mrs. Guest. Such nonsense, pretending to be better than other people. Society couldn't be carried on if we inquired into private conduct in that way, and Christianity tells us to think no evil, and my belief is that Miss Unit had no cards sent her. But the results, as we know, were not of a kind to warrant this extenuation of the past. Maggie had returned without a trousseau, without a husband, in that degraded and outcast condition to which error is well known to lead, and the world's wife, with that fine instinct which is given her for the preservation of society, saw at once that Miss Tulliver's conduct had been of the most aggravated kind. Could anything be more detestable? A girl so much indebted to her friends, whose mother as well as herself had received so much kindness from the Deanes, to lay the design in winning a young man's affections away from her own cousin, who behaved like a sister to her. Winning his affections? That was not the phrase for such a girl as Miss Tulliver. It would have been more correct to say that she had been actuated by mere unwomanly boldness and unbridled passion. There was always something questionable about her. The connection with young Wakem, which they said had been carried on for years, looked very ill, disgusting in fact. But with a girl of that disposition, to the world's wife there had always been something in Miss Tulliver's very physique that a refined instinct felt to be prophetic of harm. And for poor Mr. Stephen Guest, he was rather pitiable than otherwise. A young man of 25 is not to be too severely judged in these cases. He is really very much at the mercy of a designing, bold girl, and it was clear that he had given way in spite of himself. He had shaken her off as soon as he could. Indeed, their having parted so soon looked very black indeed for her. To be sure, he had written a letter laying all the blame on himself, and telling the story in a romantic fashion, so to try and make her appear quite innocent. Of course he would do that. But the refined instinct of the world's wife was not to be deceived, providentially. Else what would become of society? Why, her own brother had turned her from his door. He had seen enough, you might be sure, before he would do that. A truly respectable young man, Mr. Tom Tulliver, quite likely to rise in the world. His sister's disgrace was naturally a heavy blow to him. It was to be hoped that she would go out of the neighbourhood, to America or elsewhere, so as to purify the air of St. Oggs from the stain of her presence. Extremely dangerous to daughters there. No good could happen to her. It was only to be hoped she would repent, and that God would have mercy on her. He had not the care of society on his hands, as the world's wife had. It required nearly a fortnight for fine instinct to assure itself of these inspirations. Indeed, it was a whole week before Stephen's letter came, telling his father the facts, and adding that he was gone across to Holland, had drawn upon the agent at Mudport for money, was incapable of any resolution at present. Maggie, all this while, was too entirely filled with a more agonizing anxiety to spend any thought of the view that was being taken of her conduct by the world of St. Oggs. Anxiety about Stephen, Lucy, Philip, beat on her poor heart in a hard, driving, ceaseless storm of mingled love, remorse, and pity. If she had thought of rejection and injustice at all, it would have seemed to her that they had done their worst, that she could hardly feel any stroke from them intolerable since the words she had heard from her brother's lips. Across all her anxiety for the loved and the injured, those words shot again and again, like a horrible pang that would have brought misery and dread even to a heaven of delights. The idea of ever recovering happiness never glimmered in her mind for a moment. It seemed as if every sensitive fibre in her were too entirely preoccupied by pain ever to vibrate again to another influence. Life stretched before her as one act of penitence, and all she craved, as she dwelt on her future lot, was something to guarantee her from more falling. Her own weakness haunted her like a vision of hideous possibilities that made no peace conceivable, except such as lay in the sense of a sure refuge. But she was not without practical intentions. The love of independence was too strong an inheritance and a habit for her not to remember that she must get her bread, and when other projects looked vague, she fell back on that of returning to her plain sewing, and so getting enough to pay for her lodging at Bob's. She meant to persuade her mother to return to the mill by and by, and live with Tom again, and somehow or other she would maintain herself at St. Oggs. Dr. Ken would perhaps help her and advise her. She remembered his parting words at the bazaar. She remembered the momentary feeling of reliance that had sprung in her when he was talking with her, and she waited with yearning expectation for the opportunity of confiding everything to him. Her mother called every day at Mr. Deane's to learn how Lucy was. The report was always sad. Nothing had yet roused her from the feeble passivity which had come on with the first shock. But of Philip, Mrs. Tulliver had learned nothing. Naturally, no one whom she met would speak to her about what related to her daughter. But at last she summoned courage to go and see Sister Glegg, who of course would know everything, and who had been even to see Tom at the mill in Mrs. Tulliver's absence, though he had said nothing of what happened on the occasion. As soon as her mother was gone, Maggie put on her bonnet. She had resolved on walking to the rectory and asking to see Dr. Ken. He was in deep grief, but the grief of another does not jar upon us in such circumstances. It was the first time she had been beyond the door since her return. Nevertheless, her mind was so bent on the purpose of her work that the unpleasantness of meeting people on the way and being stared at did not occur to her. But she had no sooner passed beyond the narrow streets which she had to tread from Bob's dwelling than she became aware of unusual glances cast at her, and this consciousness made her hurry along nervously, afraid to look to left or right. Presently, however, she came full on Mrs. and Miss Turnbull, old acquaintances of the family. They both looked at her strangely, and turned a little aside without speaking. All hard looks were pain to Maggie, but her self-reproach was too strong for resentment. No wonder they will not speak to me, she thought. They are very fond of Lucy. But now she knew that she was about to pass a group of gentlemen who were standing at the door of the billiard-rooms, and she could not help seeing young Tory step out a little with his glass at his eye, and bow to her with that air of nonchalance which he might have bestowed on a friendly barmaid. Maggie's pride was too intense for her not to feel that sting, even in the midst of her sorrow, and for the first time the thought took strong hold of her that she would have another obloquy cast on her, besides that which was felt to be due to her breach of faith towards Lucy. But she was at the rectory now. There, perhaps, she would find something else than retribution. Retribution may come from any voice. The hardest, cruelest, most imbruted urchin at the street corner can inflict it. Surely, help and pity are rarer things, more needful for the righteous to bestow. She was shown up at once after being announced into Dr. Kent's study, where she sat amongst piled-up books, for which he had little appetite, leaning his cheek against the head of his youngest child, a girl of 3. The child was sent away with the servant, and when the door was closed, Dr. Kent said, placing a chair for Maggie, "I was coming to see you, Miss Tulliver. You've anticipated me. I'm glad you did." Maggie looked at him with her childlike directness, as she had done at the bazaar, and said, I want to tell you everything." But her eyes filled fast with tears as she said it, and all the pent-up excitement of her humiliating walk would have its vent before she could say more. "Do tell me everything," Dr. Kent said, with quiet kindness in his grave, firm voice. "Think of me as one to whom a long experience has been granted, which may enable him to help you." In rather broken sentences, and with some effort at first, but soon with the greater ease that came from a sense of relief and confidence, Maggie told a brief story of a struggle that must be the beginning of a long sorrow. Only the day before, Dr. Ken had been made acquainted with the contents of Stephen's letter, and he had believed them at once, without the confirmation of Maggie's statement. That involuntary plaint of hers, "Oh, I must go," had remained with him as the sign that she was undergoing some inward conflict. Maggie dwelt the longest on the feeling which had made her come back to her mother and brother, which made her cling to all the memories of the past. When she had ended, Dr. Ken was silent for some minutes. There was a difficulty on his mind. He rose and walked up and down the hearth with his hands behind him. At last he seated himself again and said, looking at Maggie, "You're prompting to go to your nearest friends. to remain where all the ties of your life have been formed, is a true prompting to which the Church in its original constitution and discipline responds, opening its arms to the penitent, watching over its children to the last, never abandoning them until they are hopelessly reprobate. And the Church ought to represent the feeling of the community, so that every parish should be like a family knit together by Christian brotherhood under a spiritual father. But the ideas of discipline and Christian fraternity are entirely relaxed. They can hardly be said to exist in the public mind. They hardly survive except in the partial, contradictory form they have taken in the narrow community of schismatics. And if I were not supported by the firm faith that the Church must ultimately recover the full force of that constitution, which is alone fitted to human needs, I should often lose heart at observing the want of fellowship and sense of mutual responsibility among my own flock. At present everything seems tending towards the relaxation of ties, towards the substitution of wayward choice for the adherence to obligation, which has its roots in the past. Your conscience and your heart have given you true light on this point, Miss Tulliver, and I have said all this that you may know what my wish about you, what my advice to you would be, if they sprang from my own feeling and opinion unmodified by counteracting circumstances. Mr. Kane paused a little while. There was an entire absence of effusive benevolence in this manner. There was something almost cold in the gravity of his look and voice. If Maggie had not known that his benevolence was persevering in proportion to its reserve, she might have been chilled and frightened. As it was, she listened expectantly, quite sure that there would be some effective help in his words. He went on. Your inexperience of the world, Miss Tulliver, prevents you from anticipating fully the very unjust conceptions that will probably be formed concerning your conduct. Conceptions which will have a baneful effect, even in spite of known evidence to disprove them.
Oh, I do. I begin to see, said Maggie, unable to repress this utterance of a recent pain. I know I shall be insulted. I shall be thought worse than I am.
You perhaps do not yet know, said Dr. Ken with a touch of more personal pity, that a letter is come which ought to satisfy everyone who has known anything of you, that you chose the steep and difficult path of a return to right, at a moment when that return was most of all difficult.
Oh, where is he? Said poor Maggie, with a flush and tremor that no presence could have hindered.
He has gone abroad. He has written of all that passed to his father. He has vindicated you to the utmost, and I hope the communication of that letter to your cousin will have a beneficial effect on her. Dr. Ken waited for her to get calm again before he went on. That letter, as I said, ought to suffice to prevent false impressions concerning you. But I am bound to tell you, Miss Tulliver, that not only the experience of my whole life, but my observation within the last 3 days, makes me fear that there is hardly any evidence which will save you from the painful effect of false imputations. The persons who are the most incapable of a conscientious struggle such as yours are precisely those who will be likely to shrink from you, because they will not believe in your struggle.
I fear your life here will be attended not only with much pain, but with many obstructions. For this reason, and for this only, I ask you to consider whether it will not perhaps be better for you to take a situation at a distance, according to your former intention. I will exert myself at once to obtain one for you. Oh, if I could but stop here, said Maggie. I have no heart to begin a strange life again. I should have no stay. I should feel like a lonely wanderer cut off from the past. I have written to the lady who offered me a situation to excuse myself. If I remained here, I could perhaps atone in some way to Lucy, to others. I could convince them that I'm sorry. And, she added with some of the old proud fire flashing out, I will not go away because people say false things of me. They shall learn to retract them. If I must go away at last, because others wish it, I will not go now.
Well, said Dr. Ken after some consideration, if you determine on that, Miss Tulliver, You may rely on all the influence my position gives me. I am bound to aid and countenance you by the very duties of my office as a parish priest. I will add that, personally, I have a deep interest in your peace of mind and welfare. The only thing I want is some occupation that will enable me to get my bread and be independent, said Maggie. I shall not want much. I can go on lodging where I am. I must think over the subject maturely, said Dr. Kenn, and in a few days I shall be better able to ascertain the general feeling. I shall come to see you. I shall bear you constantly in mind. When Maggie had left him, Dr. Kenn stood ruminating with his hands behind him and his eyes fixed on the carpet, under a painful sense of doubt and difficulty. The tone of Stephen's letter, which he had read, and the actual relations of all the persons concerned, forced upon him powerfully the idea of an ultimate marriage between Stephen and Maggie as the least evil, and the impossibility of their proximity in St. Oggs on any other supposition, until after years of separation, through an insurmountable prospect of difficulty over Maggie's stay there. On the other hand, he entered, with all the comprehension of a man who had known spiritual conflict, and had through years of devoted service to his fellow men, into that state of Maggie's heart and conscience which made the consent to her marriage a desecration to her. Her conscience must not be tampered with. The principle on which she had acted was a safer guide than any balancing of consequences. His experience told him that intervention was too dubious a responsibility to be lightly incurred. The possible issue either of an endeavour to restore the former relations of Lucy and Philip, or of counselling submission to this eruption of a new feeling, was hidden in a darkness all the more impenetrable because each immediate step was clogged with evil. The great problem of the shifting relation between passion and duty is clear to no man who is capable of apprehending it. The question whether the moment has come in which a man has fallen below the possibility of a renunciation that will carry any efficacy, and must accept the sway of a passion against which he had struggled as a trespass, is one for which we have no master key that will fit all cases. The casuists have become a byword of reproach, but their perverted spirit of minute discrimination was the shadow of a truth to which eyes and hearts are too often fatally sealed. The truth that moral judgments may remain false and hollow unless they are checked and enlightened with a perpetual reference to the special circumstances that mark the individual lot. All people of broad, strong sense have an instinctive repugnance to the men of maxims, because such people early discern that the mysterious complexity of our life is not to be embraced by maxims, and that to lace ourselves up in formulas of that sort is to repress all the divine promptings and inspirations that spring from growing insight and sympathy. And the man of maxims is the popular representative of the minds that are guided in their moral judgment solely by general rules, thinking that these will lead them to justice by a ready-made patent method, without the trouble of exerting patience, discrimination, impartiality, without any care to assure themselves whether they have the insight that comes from a hardly earned estimate of temptation, or from a life vivid and intense enough to have created a wide fellow feeling with all that is human. End of Book 7, Chapter 2. Recording by Andrew from Inverarnon, Scotland.